Welcome to Craft Chat Chronicles, the go-to podcast for tips on crafting best-selling fiction. Here at Craft Chat Chronicles, we bring you expert interviews, insights, and tips on writing, publishing, and marketing. For workshops, show notes, and more information, visit J.D.Myall.com.
Welcome to tonight's Craft Chat with the remarkable Gilly Segal, a rising star in young adult literature. Her debut novel, I'm Not Dying With You Tonight, was co-authored with Kimberly Jones. Kim is also a friend of the Craft Chat. We spoke to her recently too. Their debut novel is on the New York Times bestseller list, and it earned them an NAACP Image Award nomination. So you guys have just been doing all this awesome stuff. Following that, their book, Why We Fly, was celebrated as a Sidney Taylor Notable Book. And her latest venture, Captain Marvel's Shadow Code, is enchanting young readers everywhere. And this one was just Gilly's, just you by yourself on Captain Marvel,
Yep,
right?
my first solo.
Yay! Gilly is a two-time Georgia Author of the Year nominee. She brings a wealth of knowledge on writing compelling young adult stories. Tonight, she'll share her publishing journey, give writing tips and co-writing tips, and give you insights into crafting stories that captivate. Let's welcome Gilly, everyone. Yay, welcome, Gilly. For starters, can you tell us a little bit about your life before books?
So before books, I was born and raised in Florida, and I actually spent some time in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. And then after college, I decided I was going to go. I grew up sort of solidly middle class, lower middle class. My parents were small business owners, and the vagaries kind of their life owning a small business and paying employees and all of that stuff I was like, that's not for me. I need somebody else to deposit the paycheck in the bank every 2 weeks. And so I went to law school, and that's actually how I ended up in Atlanta, Georgia, where I live now. I went to Emory Law School and I started practicing law, and I spent, 2 or 3 years practicing law. I had always been a storyteller, right? I was that kid like in the back of math class, flipping to the back of her notebook and writing stories instead of doing my math, which I have to be really careful about when I talk to groups of high schoolers, because I'm like, oh, I shouldn't tell that story, but you guys are grown up, so I can say it. And so I went to law school thinking it was going to be practical and I was going to get a job at a big law firm, and I did. And although I worked for a great law firm, I was like profoundly unhappy, right? The creative side of me was missing. And I do contract law a lot of the time, which I like, but it's not the most exciting thing to do with your entire day. And I started writing again when I had been at the law firm for a year or two. And I started out writing mostly women's fiction. And then I discovered young adult novels. This was kind of the early days of the YA, the most recent YA boom. So it was like the Twilight era and Cassandra Clare and John Green were all making a real mark. And I started reading young adult novels and kind of found the voice that I loved the most and the stories that I wanted to tell. And so I started writing YA novels, and I had several very bad trunk novels. We all have trunk novels, right? The ones that you start writing and they're terrible, but they're your practice, right? They're like, you're kind of cutting your teeth and you're figuring things out. So I had a couple of those, and then I started writing with Kim, and things took off from there.
Tell the people who don't know how long it took you to get your debut, like what book that was actually.
Oh gosh. I mean 10. I mean, I'd probably written 10 by the time, somewhere between 5 and 10. I was the queen before I had 2 or 3 that I had finished, but before this book with Kim, I was the queen of what I call the 30-page novel, where I would get excited by a new idea, and you fall into it and you're like, oh, this is amazing. I'm writing and it's going great. And you write about 30 pages, and then you get to the hard part. Was before I spent a lot of time kind of educating myself about craft. So kudos to you all that you are doing that with your MFA program or your association with the Drexel community, because I really did not when I first started out. And so I'd get 30 pages in and I'd get totally lost. I wouldn't know where the plot should go. I wouldn't know how to develop the characters, and I would quit. I would get seduced by the next great idea that would come along, and I'd be like, oh, obviously that first idea was bad. Let me move on and write in this new idea. That's the one. And I would get another 30 pages in. So I have, dozens of 30-page ideas that I quit on before I learned to finish a novel. Yeah. So I mean, I have dozens of partial or trunked novels. So if you have those, don't give up. Don't give up.
Looking back, what do you think you did right that helped you break in and become the novelist that you are today?
Can I say find Kim? My co-author, Kimberly Jones, is an extraordinary creative and a gift. And I love working with her. But that's not a very helpful answer, right? I think the helpful answer is spend time on craft, right? The first thing I had to do, honestly, was learn to finish a novel and then get valuable or people who, gave me lots of affirmative feedback that made me feel great, but wasn't helping me grow and develop as a writer. And so spending time figuring out what am I doing well and what do I need to work on and where do I find that help and information. I learned that I'm a plotter. Pantsing, which is what I was doing before, does not work for me. I can't write that way. And so kind of it was my instinct to just pants, to be like, oh, I'm going to write the scenes I'm excited about. And recognizing that part of the reason that I was getting lost is because that particular method of writing doesn't work for me. And that's not to say that that's the method that anybody else should use, just that you should recognize if what you're doing isn't working, you have to kind of free yourself up to try something a little bit different.
Tell us about your publishing journey. How did you get your agent? And
Yeah, so I'm with Adams Literary, Tracy Adams and Josh Adams, and I had seen Josh Adams at a conference. I went to an SCBWI, Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators conference here in Atlanta, and I saw Josh, who was one of the agent presenters, and I really loved their approach, right? So they talked a lot about how they came to like stories, but also about how do you evaluate a deal, right? How do you evaluate a publishing deal? Do you want to take just the biggest dollars that are on the table? Do you want to find a publisher that's committing and writing to marketing? What is it that is right for you? And I really liked their approach. And so I had, like I said, I had a couple of novels. I finished one that was, I mean, let's face it, it's a little bit Cassandra Clare derivative. I had kind of an Angels and Demons urban fantasy novel that I finished writing. And I had started subbing it to agents, and I held back from subbing to them because ALIT was my dream agency. And I was like, I'm just going to wait and see. And I got a lot of rejections. And you learn from that, like this isn't the one, right? Something's not working with this particular story. And I was glad in retrospect that I held back from them because I was like, oh, I don't want that to be the impression.
mhm.
And then Kim and I started writing together. We had the idea for our novel. We started writing together. And we actually, a friend of ours was represented. I used to host this thing that I called Literary Salon. At the time, I was working 4 days a week. My Fridays were off, and I would invite all of the writers that I knew to come to my house on Friday mornings, and I would feed everybody breakfast. And then we would sit and write and talk about books and, our plots and help each other out. And one of the women who came to that was represented by Josh Adams. And so when she heard about our story and she liked it, she offered to refer us to the Adams. And we were like, yes, of course. And we sent it to her, and it was actually just a partial at the time. We had not yet finished it. And Tracy replied back and said, I love this, but I have never offered representation on a partial. And I think that you are doing your story a disservice, right? I think you're rushing because it felt very timely at that time. And she was like, I think you're doing a story a disservice. I can't offer representation based on this. And at the time I was crushed. I was like, well, there go my dreams, because, we're nothing if not dramatic as writers. But actually, in retrospect, she was really right. We were trying to fit the market instead of do the story justice. And so fortunately, we did not quit, and we finished the story, and we got lots and lots of feedback, which helped us make it better. And then we submitted to her again about a year later. And she offered us representation, and we took it.
Hey, that's exciting.
Yeah.
What do you wish you knew about publishing before your first book?
Oh, there's no brass ring, right? Getting the book deal, everything that you achieve, you're going to think that's it. I've made it now. And it's not, right? Like, you have to do this because you love it and you believe in your stories that you want to tell and you want to share them. And there's no one thing that happens. I mean, I guess if you're Stephanie Meyer in Twilight, that first book was her brass ring. So there's some exceptions to what I'm saying. But for most of the rest of us, the New York Times bestseller list didn't guarantee me another sale. I submitted a book to my publisher after that that didn't sell. They didn't want it. And I was like, how can this happen? But it just does, right? Like, it wasn't the right moment for that book. The editor wasn't the right editor for it. And so you have to love what you do enough to keep doing it, even through the difficult times, because there's no making it in this business, right? There are moments of celebration and the work is fantastic, but also it can be very disheartening if you feel like there are these milestones that you should have achieved and you're not achieving. So like evaluate about what about this that you love and do what you love as opposed to looking for the external markers of success.
Love that, but the external markers feel good.
You do.
How did you get the news that you guys made the bestsellers list, and how did you celebrate?
um, so we got the news. Our editor actually called and I didn't answer my phone. And then I think I must have been on another phone call. It was during COVID and my day job, I still have a day job. I still work full time as a lawyer. My day job was really crazy busy and I spent a lot of time on the phone in those first few months of COVID. And I didn't answer his call. And then all of a sudden I started getting Kim's calling me repeatedly, right? Like she's calling, she's not leaving a message, she's not text messaging me, she's just calling and calling. And I was like, oh, I better answer that and see what happened. And she is the one who told me. And we both cried a little on the phone.
Oh.
And then it was COVID, so we couldn't actually celebrate. Like much later, we took ourselves out to a fancy dinner, but we couldn't actually celebrate right away.
And how'd you find out about the NAACP Image Award nomination?
Kim actually told me about that as well. This was before COVID. I was at my day job and my day job is very supportive of my writing. I'm tremendously fortunate in that I work for an advertising agency and they love being able to say like, we're so creative, even our lawyer is creative. And so I am celebrated at my day job, but I also don't talk about it a lot there because I'm the lawyer and it's just sort of, you wear a different hat and you have a different persona. So I get this text message from Kim and it was a screenshot of the nomination. The NAACP does Instagram posts to announce it, and she like texted me, and this was Kim's lifelong dream, right? So we were both, she was falling on the floor, she didn't have words, I was falling on the floor, I was like, I can't believe this. And I went running down the stairs at work like, who am I going to say this to? I can't say this to anybody. And actually a friend of mine, she remains a dear friend of mine, like ran into me on the stairs and she was like, are you okay? And I was like, this is so braggy, but I can't help myself. Look at this. And that was wonderful. It was our publisher's first ever NAACP Image Award nomination. So they went all out for us and they sent us to the awards where we did not win, but we had a blast. Like we sat near Harold Perrineau. If any of you are old enough to remember the Leonardo DiCaprio Romeo and Juliet, he is forever my Mercutio, and he and his wife are just the most amazingly beautiful people I've ever seen in my life. And we sat near them at the ceremony and it was spectacular.
Awesome. That's really cool. With co-writing, I know you're a lawyer, so did you guys do a co-writing agreement? How did that work out?
We did actually, yeah. And I would highly recommend that anybody who is co-writing do a co-writing agreement. We didn't do it before we began, right? We did it before we decided to start submitting for publishers, because when you're writing just for the craft of it, there's no business, right? There's no business of writing. But once you decide that you are going to publish, now you have a business side. Now this is a career and you have to and this is another thing that I would say, like before you get into publishing, this is not just a creative art the minute that you share your art with the rest of the world. Now you have a business side of the house, and that's true whether you're going with a traditional publisher, a small publisher, or self-publication. And you have to worry about things like marketing, you have to worry about things like legal, you have to worry about things like royalties. So I drafted an agreement that was, ours is sort of mostly balanced. The notion would be like, if we ever end up in a disagreement, this is going to be the thing that we pull out of the drawer and say, if we ever disagree, here's how it's all going to break down. Kim had her manager review it, right? So it's not unfair that I have the legal background and she doesn't. And we signed it, and that kind of governs our relationship to this day. And you can find samples of them online. Don't ever just pull a thing off. I don't care what AI says. It's not as smart as people. Don't ever just pull an agreement off LegalZoom, please. Go and read it. Make sure you understand what the terms say. The Authors Guild provides legal services to lawyers at very low cost. So if you ever need a legal agreement as a creative person, as an author, go to the Authors Guild, join the Authors Guild, and get low cost legal services. They can help you with things like co-author agreements. They can also help you with things like if you end up unagented selling a book, you don't have an agent yet, or you're working with a small press or something like that, they will also review your publishing contracts to make sure you're not trapping yourself into a bad deal.
Love that. I love that. So what do you think makes your co-writing team successful? What are the elements of a good co-writing?
Oh, I love that question. We lean on our strengths and lean on each other for our weaknesses, right? Like as authors, we all have things that we're wonderful at, and we all have things that are growth opportunities in my corporate speak, or things that are tough for us, right? So like Kim comes from a screenwriting background, which means her dialogue and her pacing are top notch. I mean, they're just amazing, right? She knows how to pace a book, especially our first book is really drafted to be fast paced. It takes place over the course of one evening. It's intended for reluctant readers. And so she brings that dialogue. She brings that snappy dialogue. I come from a traditional novel background, right? So sometimes she would send me pages and I would be like, this is a script. Where are they? What do they say? What do they feel? What's their interiority? And she would be like, oh, well, the camera is going to show there's no camera, right? So I would sort of bring that strength of novel background, dialogue, interiority. And then I would submit pages to her and she would be like, these people sound like they're 40 years old. And I would be like, well, I am 40 years old. But she would sort of do be like, no, this is not, we need to snap up this dialogue. We need to have more dialogue on the page. There's too much description and interiority. So I think a co-author duo where you have different strengths and weaknesses so that you can lean on each other for them is really powerful. I honestly think the most important part of being a co-authoring duo is to be really, really honest about how you're going to do it. This is that business side of things again, right? So Kim and I both had and still have full-time jobs. That means we cannot devote 15 hours a week to writing. We write physically side by side. That's how we write best. And so, we used to use those Friday mornings. We would use our weekends. And it was in the early days, I think there was more tension around, are you able to write? I'm not able to write. You didn't do your pages this week. Well, I didn't get feedback from you. And once we sort of had that very honest conversation of like, here's what I actually have to give to this project. And does that work for you? It became really seamless, and we don't actually fight and argue. We always joke that we should make up some sort of beef to tell because it's so boring to be like, no, we never fight, but we don't fight. And it's because we're just really upfront about what we have to give to a project, and we accept each other. We meet each other where we are, right? Like at various points over the last, we've been writing together for 8 years now. Both of us have had to be like, I have to step back from this project. I can't work on this right now. And you have to honor that for your creative partner.
How do you come up with the ideas, or how do you decide which topics to work on as a team and which one to do individually?
I usually spam her with links. Links are my love language. If I start texting you links to articles, or I had a brief affair with TikTok, in which I really love TikTok, and I would send TikToks back and forth. I've weaned myself off TikTok. But I will like see something and be like, look at this. And that's usually me being like, do you want to write about this thing with me? So it's actually sort of been, anytime the project is going to benefit from two voices and two lived experiences is typically when we want to write together. And then our solo projects have come to us really like from totally different avenues. We have separate agents now. Kim's moved on to another agent. And so our solo projects have sort of come from our agent as opposed to from us.
Now, does that make it complicated to do group work with two agents involved? How does that happen?
No, they play pretty well together, and you want that if you guys are at the stage where you're looking at agents, right? Like if your agent doesn't play well with others, I would ask some questions about why. But they represent us, they work for us, and it's in their best interests for us to be successful. And so, they want to collaborate together. And they, sort of when we have a project that we're pitching, they get together and they agree upon the pitch and they agree upon who's going to send it. And they sort of look at who has the relationships with the editors that we're targeting for a particular project, those types of things.
Okay, that's cool. That's good to know. You guys often write about important social issues. How do you do that in a way that's like balanced and respectful and also keeps you from ripping each other's hair out while you're talking about different topics?
Yeah, we had a friendship first, right? Before we ever, I mean, we write about race relations in America, right? Like that's sometimes really hard. But we had a friendship before. We had a relationship before. We have literally lived through romantic breakups, our children's ups and downs, the election of 2016. We were here in my house crying on my couch together. So we started from a place of friendship and a place of mutual respect. And we actually developed a code word that was like, I have a difficult question to ask, right? This question comes from a place of ignorance or it comes from a place of misunderstanding. And we approached it sort of with that background of knowing how much we really cared about each other, going, I know that Kim would never want to do anything to hurt me, but she needs the answer. She needs this information. She needs this conversation for the book to be its best self. And so we would say the code word, and that would kind of be the introduction to a brave space conversation, right? Not a safe space, because growth doesn't come from staying safe. Growth comes from being brave. And we would have the conversation. And we always followed the passion, right? Whoever was most passionate about her point was the one who won the argument, because the book was always better served by following the passion, right? It was never better served by watering down and compromising and meeting in the middle, right? Like that was never the right creative answer. So we just found our way through it. We put the relationship first. We still put the relationship first. We don't need the code word so much anymore. Now we use it to gossip. Like if we have good industry gossip, we'll be like, code word, let me tell you what so-and-so did. So everyone's always like, what's the code word? And I'm like, I can't tell you. Because if you hear us say it, you know what's coming next.
Okay. For those that might be a little afraid about tackling topics like race relations and sensitive topics, what advice would you give them?
Do the work to get it to be thoughtful, to understand and learn. The very first question I would say is ask yourself why you're the right person to tell this story. So for me, with I'm Not Dying with You Tonight, it was an article that I saw, like I said, links are my love language. It was about a school bus that had become trapped behind a police barricade during the unrest in Baltimore after the murder of Freddie Gray. And it was a bus of high school students, and I thought to myself, so it was a predominantly Black neighborhood, although it was a mixed neighborhood, so there were white students as well. And I thought, what happened to the students on that bus, and how did they get home? But I also knew that trying to tell that story by myself, I didn't have the lived experience to do it well, to do it justice. I can't tell the story of a Black community in Baltimore. I don't know that. I don't know. I would never be able to do that culture justice. So the first thing is, am I the right person to tell that story? And if you're not the right person to tell that story, it's okay to let it go, right? I think sometimes we feel like, oh, this is the one, but there's no one, right? We're creative people. There's always going to be another. There's always going to be an idea that we're suited for. And then once you've decided you're the one who's going to tell the story, do the work to get it right, to make sure that you have an understanding of the culture that you're talking about. Make sure that you are being plausible and thoughtful about how you're rendering it. If you are writing outside of your own experience, are you getting input from people who have that experience? Sometimes we call them sensitivity readers, sometimes we call them authenticity readers, but it's really no different than, doing research. And if you're a thriller writer and you're writing about a murder and you talk to a doctor to see if you got the wound right, it's really no different than writing about another culture and seeing, did I do this culture justice? And then be willing to take hard feedback, like whether it's before your project gets published or after project gets published. No culture, no community, no hard topic is a monolith. People have very different feelings about it. And so you're going to get hard feedback. You're going to get people who hate your work, and you're going to get people who tell you did a terrible job. And you have to sort of put your big kid pants on and weather that storm and accept that if you wrote the best story that you can write, that's all you can do.
What do you think are the essential elements of a good young adult novel?
Ooh, I think plot and character are really central to young adult writing, right? Different from adult novels, which can take a lot more time with description, can take a lot more time with meandering, right? Like at the core of a good YA novel, it's a coming of age story. You have a young person who is navigating most often their entry into a wider world, right? Middle grade is a lot about how do I interact with my own family and my immediate community, and YA is how do I interact with the larger world. And so, that's a very emotional, character-driven journey. And also YA is really unabashedly about plot a lot of times, or at least the YA that I love is. And so, you don't have 1,000 pages to write a wandering philosophical tome about the meaning of man, right? Like you can talk about the significance of man on earth, but it's got to be in the context of a rip-roaring adventure as well, because you just don't hold young people's attention without that.
Very true, very true. Can you give us some tips on creating a good villain or antagonist?
Villains and antagonists are the most fun. They have to be plausible, right? Like, unless you're writing a Phineas and Ferb screenplay and it's Doofenshmirtz, which he's always my example. If you haven't watched Phineas and Ferb, by the way, it's fantastic and you really should, because it's really, really clever writing, even though, it's intended for kids, but there's a lot of grown-up stuff in there too. But Doofenshmirtz, the villain, is like super cartoonish and implausible, and he's fun because he is. But in a novel, you have to have a plausible villain. They have to have a motive. They have to want something that seems achievable. And I think they have to have a little teeny bit of sympathetic element to them, right? You also, I think, have to think about your villain in relationship to your hero. So in my Captain Marvel novel, I don't know if you all are Marvel fans or not, but if you are, you will know that, like, Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel, is the most overpowered superhero in any universe, period. She is indestructible. Physiologically, she's almost indestructible. She shoots lasers from her hands. She can turn into this like literal comet shooting through the sky called binary. Like, it's really hard to harm. Yep, I love Captain Marvel too. She's the best. But it's really hard to like take a chunk out of Captain Marvel. So when I was working on the book, I was like, well, how do you threaten such a seemingly invincible character? Well, the only thing that's vulnerable in Captain Marvel is her mind, right? Like, she's I write in the comics universe, not the cinematic universe. And so she's recently discovered that she is a half alien. Her mother is actually an alien. Spoiler alert. Sorry about that. So she's sort of grappling with this big identity question of, like, for her, it's who am I? And how much of all this amazing stuff that I achieved in my past is because I worked my ass off for it? And how much, and you can't say ass in a Marvel book, by the way. You can say badass, but you cannot say ass to mean the backside. Fun fact. How much of this is because of because of how her own hard work, and how much of it is just because she was born this way, right? So she's grappling with a big identity question, and that led me to her villain, who is the flip side of Carol's coin, right? Like, she did get her powers from a stone, and like, but for some people in Carol's life, like, she easily could have been the villain herself, this particular villain. So I think your villain and your hero should exist kind of in tandem, and if they don't, you have to ask yourself, why are these two characters in this particular book? If I could swap my villain out with any other villain and still challenge my hero, I think you haven't dug deep enough into your story.
Love that. How do you avoid the dreaded saggy middle?
I don't know if I do. No, for me, it is plotting, right? Like, I am an intense plotter. And I get feedback on my plot. Like, I do outlines, really intense outlines, and I get feedback on my outline before I ever put pen to page. So I can sort of try to identify that. And then if you're another signal for me is often if I'm bored writing it, I have to ask whether the reader is going to be bored reading it. So sometimes your own reaction to a scene is a good gauge of whether or not you're moving the plot along. I have this method that I use called the BCD method, and you can I said before, you should get good feedback, and you always should. So you can use this with your experienced feedback people, and you can use it with inexperienced people pretty effectively as well. And you give them a copy of your manuscript, and you say, everywhere where you're bored, write a B, everywhere where you're confused, write a C, and everywhere where you don't care, write a D. And if you find in various sections, especially in the middle, that you're getting a lot of B's and a lot of D's, your pacing is off. You're in the saggy middle. And then you just pull those scenes. You reimagine, you pull, you try different things until you unlock the solution.
How do you maintain tension in those sense? I don't know.
So for suspense, the best tip that I've ever seen about this, and this isn't for me, I can't remember who it's from, so I'm stealing freely. Great writer steal. your suspense comes not from your reader not knowing what's going to happen, but from caring, right? So you have to, it's a very delicate balance of withholding enough information from your reader that they go, ooh, what's coming next? And I care about what's coming next without confusing them, right? So I see a lot of, novice writers, particularly in the mystery or thriller genres, they're just sort of, they'll get to a place, they'll be like, if only she had remembered this important thing that happened in the past, or she couldn't stop thinking about that April. And there's only so much of that that you can do before you frustrate your reader, right? And at some point in time, you're withholding from the reader. You don't want to do that, right? You want your character to be in the dark, but not your reader. And that, I think, is what builds suspense and tension.
How do you hook readers from the very first page? What are the essential elements of a good first page?
Ooh. You want to start your story at the moment before all hell breaks loose, basically, right? You want them to immediately have a sense of who we are and where we are, right? Who are our characters? Where are they and why do we care about them? So you want to give them something big and important to do on the page, right? This is the classic. You don't want to open your novel with your mirror, with your character standing in front of the mirror and, admiring themselves or looking out at a field, right? Like those are not things that build tension. So you want to build tension on that first page. You want to establish who and where we are. I had something else, but it slipped my mind. It'll come back to me.
Okay, what are your tips for tying it up, like for a compelling ending?
Pay it off, right? Like whatever you're aiming for, don't forget to pay it off, right? Even if you're writing a multi-part series, every novel should be self-contained. So if we started out with, if your character, in our first novel, I'm Not Dying with You Tonight, the character that I predominantly wrote is an incredibly lonely kid. She's been uprooted from her life. She's moved to a new city. Her mom has abandoned her. She's really, really lonely. And her journey has been to find friends where she is now. So at the end of it, the payoff for her is that she's building a relationship with the other character in the story. So wherever you started your character, made sure that you have moved them all the way to the place where they need to end up, because that's the payoff for your reader.
I love that. What advice do you have for other writers who are considering the co-writing like you and Kim have done?
Yeah, have the hard conversation about what you guys can contribute to your project up front, right? Is it whether it's time, if you are not in the same city, what is a realistic expectation? How many pages can you realistically commit to this per week? Make sure that you really respect each other creatively. I have tried to co-author with other people and it fell apart. And in every instance, it's fallen apart because we don't actually respect each other's creative product at the end of the day, right? So like you can't force I know that sounds really harsh, but like if you find yourself wanting to school your co-author about craft, you're not at the same place at your career and maybe you guys are not the best co-authors, right? Or vice versa, if you feel like your co-author is schooling you about craft and you don't really need it, like you have to sort of respect what each person brings to the project. And if you don't, it's best to go your separate ways early. Like don't invest a lot of time in those projects.
Okay, I'm going to jump back to your agent because I have a question. What does your agent relationship look like? Like, do you submit ideas and then they let you know which they think they can sell, or do you submit whole manuscripts? How does your agent relationship work?
That's a really good question. So we talk kind of in advance before I invest a lot of time writing something because I am a very slow writer and I do have a very demanding full-time day job and 3 children that I balance all of this with. And so I do not want to spend 2 years working on something that she turns around and goes, I'm not feeling that. So I run everything by her sort of early on in the process. She tends to let me drive. I'll say to her, look, I'm interested in this. And she'll be like, if that's what you want to do, that's what I'm going to go out there and try to sell for you. Right. She's honest with me. Like, I sort of have flirted in the past with the idea of a graphic novel. I have a middle grade graphic novel idea. I'm not an artist though. And she has been very upfront with me that where the market is right now is author illustrators are what the market is prioritizing in the graphic novel space. And she's like, she doesn't tell me not to, but she just sort of warns, like, you might sink a lot of time into this project that nobody's going to look at because you are not an author illustrator. So she's very upfront with me about where the market is. And that's what that's what she earns her money off of, right? Like, she knows the market. I don't. But also, if I say to her, like, my next thing that I'm going to go on submission with is like a dual timeline historical and modern narrative, and she was like, if that's that's where your heart is, that's what we're going to try to sell. So it's a pretty open and honest partnership, I think.
That's good. So when she talks to you about the market, what has she mentioned? What seems to be selling now?
Romantasy is really big right now, right? The romance fantasy stuff. Mysteries are still pretty hot. Graphic novels for middle grade are very hot, although, like I said, they're really looking for, or at least 6 or so months ago when we talked about this, they were really looking for author illustrators. Sadly, my talent is with words, not with pictures, so that's never going to be me. Yeah, that's kind of in the YA world. I don't really know about the adult market, if any of you are adult writers. Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm. So you guys can ask Gilly questions now if you have any. She also is a lawyer, so she can answer some of your writerly, lawyerly questions, like if you can have your characters visit McDonald's and things like that in your story. So if you have any of those type of questions, feel free to ask those as well. Does anybody have any questions for Gilly?
Hi, I've got a question. First of all, thank you so much for visiting us. I direct the Drexel MFA, and we love these craft chats. JD, you do such an amazing job, and I love your questions. And so my question is this: in terms of your partnership, I really loved hearing you talk about how you write side by side and how you essentially fill in or edit each other. But my question is this: do you like assign each other chapters? Like, okay, I wrote this chapter, you're writing the next one. Like, how does that work in terms of actually parsing, doling out the work itself?
So for both of our 2 published co-authored novels, they're told in 2 voices. There's 2 main characters. And for our first novel, for the first draft especially, Kim primarily took responsibility for one character and I primarily took responsibility for the other. And then by about the second or third draft of that, we realized that that kind of wasn't working. And we would sit side by side and we talk it like we're all talking right now. And then she did this, and then she said that, and what would she say here? And we wrote all of our second book that same way. I mean, again, there was still sort of 2 main voices characters. And the nice thing about co-authoring is that really ensures that the characters don't sound exactly like one another, right? That's one of the hard parts if you're writing a multi-POV story, is if you're not careful, everybody sounds the same. And for us, it's built in that they're not going to, because we have 2 voices contributing to it. But we tried the back and forth draft chapter by chapter thing. I know a lot of other authors who do things that way, and it just didn't work for us, which just goes to show there's no one right or wrong way to do things. Like the wrong way to do things is never to change your process if it's failing you. That's the only wrong way to write, is to stick with something that ain't working. But yeah, that's kind of how we literally side by side. I'm a typer, like I'm a visual, and Kim is an auditory person. So she's like talking out loud and I'm like, wait, I can't type that fast. And we'll stop each other. We also be like, we have another code word, this one I can share because we don't use it to gossip. But oftentimes when you're brainstorming, and this is a challenge, right? Is you're looking for that perfect phrase, that perfect thing. And I think that's some of what writer's block is, right? Is the gap between our expectations and our reality. And so we have developed, we say not, but, and we're and then she says, I hate you now, Jim, not but. And we know that's like a placeholder phrase. Something in the sentiment of I hate you, Jim, is going to go there, but we're not going to halt our forward progress by trying to wordsmith the perfect phrase right now. We'll come back to that on a revision. So we use not, you all can have not but, because it's not secret. I will do that in my solo writing too as well. Like on my first draft, I will literally have all caps, brackets, something cool here, or she has a revelation about this. And then, you know, again, I think particularly if you're someone like me who struggles with drafting, I'm a slow drafter. If I let myself get stalled swirling around perfection, I will never finish. And so I have to be like, give myself permission, hold the place, and give myself permission to keep writing and come back to it on a future draft.
Is it easier to write individual or as a team?
I think it's easier to write as a team, especially because sometimes you're like, I have written this novel into a corner. You get it out now. It feels like your problem for a little while. But yeah, I mean, you have that sort of built in. Writing is such a solitary thing, except it's really not. Like if you are only writing solitary, I would really encourage you to find a writing group that you can go bounce stuff off of, right? Even if you're not sharing pages quite yet. For Captain Novel early on, I was under a very strict NDA. I was not allowed to share that I was writing about Captain Marvel for quite a while. And so I had this group of writer friends that I oftentimes will like bounce plot problems off of. And so we went to a coffee shop and I'm like, okay, I'm going to be really oblique and obtuse, but I'm going to be like, what if I had there's a mother and daughter thing in the Captain Marvel book. They're not my superhero characters. They're the people that I got to contribute to the Marvel canon, and I love them, but they're sort of a mother and daughter situation. And I would be like, okay, so if you were a daughter who was mad at her mother, and I would have to come up with proxies for things like shoots lasers out of her hands. But we sat in a coffee shop and bounced ideas off of one another. And so with a writing partner, you have that built in. And if you're writing solo, you might have to go out and find your crew that you can do that with.
Does anybody else have any other questions?
I had one. What is your research process and how do you split that with your co-author?
Oh, that's such a fun question. We are a very people-oriented research group, right? So we talk to and interview people who have the lived experiences that we're trying to put on the page. So for I'm Not Dying with You Tonight, we talked to riot survivors, everything from the Philadelphia riot of the 1960s to Baltimore to LA. Kim interviewed someone who had survived the LA riots who talked about sort of pockets of violence, and that is directly on the page in our book. I interviewed a police SWAT team to hear like what would the police really be doing, like how does something start small and become really big, what are the conditions in the city, where would you be responding, and we split it up kind of based on relationship, like who knows the person that they can ask to spend sometimes 30 minutes and sometimes 3 hours. Like I sat with the SWAT guy for 3 hours and the first thing he said to me was like, where's your map? And we had this like janky, like it was like a folded up piece of, legal paper like this. And I like put it on the page and he marked things on it for me. But it's relationship based and people based. For my historical novel that I'm working on right now, it's a totally different process. And this one is, like the Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole scene where she's falling down and like grabbing things would be a very orderly picture of what I'm doing. I mean, it's a lot of book research. It's a historical novel. And the more you write, the more that you discover things like, did they have refrigerators during the time period that I'm working on, or was like at what point into like where am I in the history? What did they have? What did they wear? How did they communicate? How did they get around? And that affects everything, not just from like art writing the scene, but also the timeline, right? So I'm writing in the lead up to World War II, the 1930s and early 1940s. Information doesn't travel as fast as I needed it to. So I was like, oh, shoot, she can't know this in a matter of days. She would not know this for a matter of months, right? So it's going to affect not just the immediate scene construction, but sometimes your whole plot. So that is a rabbit hole that I will confess, I'm having a difficulty climbing out of this rabbit hole because it's endless.
How do you guys handle marketing as a team?
Kim is front of house and I am back of house. That's how we handle. Kim is an amazing orator and speaker. And I mean, I say that a little facetiously, right? Like we're both, we do really well in front of crowds. This is the thing I'll tell. This is a dirty secret to marketing, right? I'm going to ruin some love. I'm going to break some hearts right now. There is nothing that you as an individual can do that competes with the money of a big publishing house. Period. End of story. I will brook no challenge, right? Like if a big publisher decides to put a lot of money behind a book, it's going to be successful. Now, that doesn't mean that your career is over, right? What it means is you have to figure out what marketing works for you, and that's where you put your time, treasure, and talent. So for Kim and me, it's getting in front of people. We do the best when we're in front of crowds. So we prioritize things like book conferences, librarian conferences, bookseller conferences, school visits, and we spend a lot of time working on our shtick, right? Like it's not accidental. We get together, we talk about what works and what didn't. We debrief afterwards. We're both trained orators. Kim literally went to clown college at the Ringling Brothers and Parma Bailey Circus Clown College. And I'm a lawyer where an enormous part of my training in law school was public speaking. So that's what works for us. And we prioritize, if we have to travel ourselves sometimes to make it to a conference or to an event, we'll do that because we know that that's a successful way for us to sell books. TikTok content, Instagram content, all that stuff, not successful for me. I don't put a lot of time into that. There are ways to do that successfully. They're just not my natural, so I don't put a lot of time in that, and it doesn't sell a lot of books for me. So it's really like once you sort of remove yourself from expecting that you're going to be able to compete with a big publisher, what works for you? Where's your audience? This is really dependent upon who you're writing for. My audience is at school and going to school libraries. So for me, it's incredibly important to be talking to teachers and librarians because that's who's putting my book in the hands of kids. If you are writing women's fiction, your audience is in book clubs. How are you going to get in front of the book clubs? How are you going to get to them? If you are writing nonfiction, I don't know the answer to this, right? You got to figure like, where is your audience? And you find out where they are. And then you meet them there. You develop the things that you work hard on the things that you're good at. You develop the things that you're not. Here's the other thing I would say, like when I meet new, young, or emerging authors, the number one thing that I would spend my money on, if you're not good at public speaking, is media training. There is always going to be an element, even if you don't love it, of public speaking associated with selling your book. And so if you are not already a trained public speaker and you are uncomfortable with it, spend time and money developing your skills. You're going to have to be able to pitch your book in under 30 seconds. And it can't be, well, it's an exploration of the identity of a half alien and she's wondering where she fits in society. Like that is not a successful pitch for Captain Marvel book, right? So before your book comes out, spend time developing your 30-second pitch, spend time developing your shtick, whatever it is, right? Like if you can make them laugh, make them cry, make them think, you have won that public appearance, and that's not accidental, and you can develop those things. So that's all the stickers in the world and for pre-order campaigns didn't move the needle for my books. But being able to get in front of librarians and make them cry was really successful. So figure out what works for you and spend time on that.
And do you have any quick tips for school visits that worked for you? Like how did you?
Yeah, be flexible, right? Visuals are great, right? Like they've got a lot of stuff that pulls at their attention. And so this is another thing that you can work on in media training is learn to read a room. And when the thing that you're doing is failing, they're bored, they're talking amongst themselves, they're not paying attention, move on, like abandon ship, move on, do something else. School visits require a lot of flexibility.
Love that. Anybody else have any questions for Gilly?
Yeah, I had a quick question. Thank you so much for doing this. And sorry the bad resolution of my camera here. I'm doing a novel that's set in an actual historical event, though it's not an historical novel. It's like a YA teen fiction novel, and it's based on some of my life and some not of my life, but it's centered around a real event, and there's some real rumors in there that happened in real time. Do I have to be worried? I'm not letting it stop me from writing the story, mind you, but when it comes time to that being read by people, does that become a worry with the publishers, whatever, that they're going to need permissions or that they're worried about what it'll do? It's not like anything's being badmouthed or anything's unfactual. There is some dramatic license in the timeline, but other than that, you know what I mean? It's still true to its form.
Yeah, I mean, if it's inspired by real events, but not actual real events, you're probably okay. be inspired by don't actually be the real events, especially if you're talking about real people. I would be a little bit cautious about real people because you can get into the like defamation and slander space. And at that point in time, you're also not really writing fiction, you're writing memoir, which is a different story. But so I would sort of say like make sure that it's truly inspired by real events and not just a reflection of them. And
Yeah,
yes,
no, it doesn't go on to slander or talk about any of the people so much as relate the actual events that are happening as they happen. Like I said, the dates might be a little off, but other than that, the the actual events are true and they're in the press and all that stuff. I mean, they were all legitimate.
yeah, I mean, nobody owns facts, right? Nobody owns factual history. Your characters can go to McDonald's, by the way.
Right.
If it's sort of like what we call de minimis use, right? Like they went to McDonald's and had dinner, and it's not like the whole. Your book is not called, surviving McDonald's, so much that it seems like a brand is owning it. But yeah, I mean, facts are facts, right? If these are things that happened, again, just be a little bit cautious about the license that you take, because it's your publisher will ask you for an indemnification. So if you're too close to real events and they're non-factual or they're debatably factual, you have the potential to get asked some hard questions.
Right. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Any more questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll go. Again, like everyone else has already said, thank you so much for taking the time to meet and do this. It's very interesting to me, actually, how many lawyers end up becoming writers. Everyone I know, even the professors I worked under. I also hate it because every time I tell my mother, I get the most satisfying "I told you so" humanly imaginable from her because I didn't want to go to law school. I chose to try to do the path of writing while I'm here. But um, my question is kind of piggybacking off of what Jonathan had been saying. How willing are you to deviate away from facts for the sake of the story, where you incorporate uh, more fictional elements into it, even though this is based off true events that have actually happened? How much are you willing to deviate, and how much are the people that you talk to who experience these situations, or even readers, because we all know how picky readers are when they also like to do the "I told you so." Um, how much of that are you willing to make up for the sake of your story?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how, steely a spine you've got, right? It's your story. You get to decide how much you deviate and how much you don't. If it all hangs together, if you're telling a great story with deviations from the things that people have shared with you, go for it, right? Like you're fine. If you are talking about real life events and you deviate from them a whole lot, I, in a historical novel, I would be a little bit careful about that. Right? I would be a little bit careful about that just because it's like, unless you're telling an alt history of some sort, like why do you need to deviate that much? So for example, the historical novel that I'm working on right now is set in the 1930s. You can all imagine some big world events were taking place in the 1930s. If I don't have Hitler invading Poland at the right time, why am I doing that? Right? Like I can't in a realistic novel, non-alt history, non-fantastical novel, there's kind of no justification to deviate from that massively, right? And what I need to do then is figure out how to make my fictional elements align with the historical timeline, or I've got a bigger problem. But if it's small stuff, I'm trying to think of small stuff that I would deviate from. You know, they did or didn't have a particular event, the movie wasn't out yet and they're going to see a particular movie, right? Like the small stuff I think doesn't matter so much, but huge changes to actual historical facts are, in my opinion, you can do whatever you want, but in my opinion, you're going to rub your readers the wrong way, and you better have a really good reason to do that, because if you don't, I'm not sure, like that's you serving, that's like self-serving instead of serving the story. Does that make sense?
It does. Any more questions?
Yeah, I had a question that you mentioned, I guess a legal question, when you mentioned you can put in your book, like they went to McDonald's. How much of that can you actually get away with, like song quotes or saying, they went to, so and so's concert or things like that?
Yeah.
Does it ever get to a point where you would face legal action, I guess, for putting that in?
Yes, and song quotes is a great example. So you're talking about two different things there. One is trademark, and you're talking about three things: trademark, copyright, and rights of publicity. So trademark is brand names, and as long as you're using it to refer to the actual thing in what's called a de minimis way, right? So inconsequential, not important to the story, not a major deal, you're unlikely to get sued, right? Because you're not, the purpose of trademark is to protect the integrity of the brand name in the eyes of the consuming public. So if your novel about two teens on a road trip has them stopping at a McDonald's, nobody's going to be confused about the source or origin of your novel. Everybody knows it's not McDonald's. If you use so much of McDonald's that it starts to look like maybe McDonald's sponsored your novel, now you have a problem. But again, if you're doing just reference to the actual thing in a non-offensive, disparaging way, and it's minimal, you're unlikely to get a trademark lawsuit. Copyright is really different. So if you're using copyrighted text, almost any amount of song lyrics will get you in trouble. So and you can license these things, right? If you have song lyrics throughout your book, you can go and get permission from the owner of the rights of the songs. It'll cost you money. Almost always. There's very few times when people volunteer this up. So that is a big, big, big watch out. Song lyrics, quotes from novels that are still under copyright protection, any of those things you want to exercise extreme caution. Reference to actual living famous people, it's sort of the same as the brand, right? If it's minimal, it's just to refer to, they went to a Beyonce concert. Beyonce is unlikely to sue you for one reference in your novel. If your whole novel is called Finding Beyonce and it's all about how Beyonce has disappeared because of some terrible scandal that's happened in her life, well, maybe now we have some despair. Sorry, I didn't mean to give a thumbs up. Now we have some disparagement issues going on, right? So there's a little bit of a spectrum of what you can do safely and what you can't. And again, the Authors Guild is your best source for asking these questions.
Okay, because I was also thinking when you were talking about like historical fiction, how does that work for companies that no longer exist?
Yeah, you don't really have to worry so much about companies that no longer exist because there's no one who owns any rights left in those anymore. Right? Who's gonna sue you? Whose rights are you infringing on if the company is defunct? So is Sears still around? Do we still have Sears? Like if you're talking about she went shopping at the Sears and Roebuck, Sears and Roebuck is not suing me for that. So it's de minimis use is usually not a problem. A lot of people will do. They will be like, he lip synced that song to her about the scarf that goes missing, right? If you're a Taylor Swift fan, you know what I'm talking about. So you can refer to it, but if you're actually quoting the song itself, it's going to depend on how much you change. But in order to keep it recognizable, you're probably going to have to quote enough that it's potentially infringing.
Okay.
I would refer to it obliquely, or alternatively, like, is it necessary to have the real world example, or can you create an in-world, famous, songwriter that they're quoting, right? So, think about, and you'd have to sort of seed this throughout the story, but I always love it when the world is so fully developed that there's a famous singer that, in the early chapters, it's mentioned briefly and you hear they're in the background on the radio, and then later you do get quotes from their songs, but they're ones that you've made up, right? But you've sort of created this world that feels very full and whole because you've seeded throughout references to this imaginary famous person. If you're dying to have song lyrics in your book and you can't actually get permission to use them, I would do it that way with a made up character, and then you get to write your own angsty song lyrics.
Love that. Love that. Anybody else have questions? No? Okay. What's up next for you, Gilly?
Well, I'm working on this historical novel, which who knows whether it will sell or not. And I'm actually working on some screenplay stuff because I wanted to stretch my creative muscles and see if I can do screenplay work. So we'll see.
Yeah, we'll be seeing you on the big screen too. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, this is great. It was lovely to meet you. Best of luck. I hope that someday I'm sitting in your craft chats.
Yes, ma'am. It's been awesome. And hopefully you consider Drexel for your daughter because it's a good program.
Yes, we're coming to visit this summer.
All right. You have a blessed one. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
That wraps up today's Craft Chat Chronicles with J.D.Myall. Thanks for joining us. If you liked the episode, please comment, subscribe, and share. For show notes, writing workshops, and tips, head to jdmyall.com. That's jdmyall.com. While you're there, join JD's mailing list for updates, giveaways, and more.